once they upload, of course. Let's see. Cool. Okay, so dear students, Thomas Hobbes. But before we get into Thomas Hobbes, I want to explain you first why this is modern, right? Because what he's going to argue for is not modern at all, but the way he does is because Thomas Hobbes is the first of the social philosophers. Social contract is a genre of political philosophy that is different from the things we've seen before. It's, say, the bridge between pre-modern political thinking, like Aristotle, and modern thinking. Because what it does uniquely is that it argues for politics in a bottom-up way. You see, everything we've seen so far, right, did not start from the people. It did not start from the individual. It started from the top. So either with Machiavelli, this is obvious, right? He's talking directly to the people who are already in power. And he's advising them what to do. But also, if we talk about Thomas of Aquinas, right? He's asking, what does God really want? And how can we interpret that into creating laws for a society? Which again starts at the top and then you reason down how that impacts people's lives. Same with Plato and Aristotle, they did talk about how do we get the ideal society, and then afterwards they figure out how individuals fit in there. So the starting point is never you. The starting point is always some ideal or some power base for political reasoning. Social contract theory goes the other way around. It starts by asking what the individual would want, with the emphasis on would want. It's not about literally asking them, but they sit back and they think, what do people want out of politics? And that's how they start reasoning their theory, which is a distinctly modern way of thinking about it, right? Because you start from the individual. You at least pretend to actually care about that. Now, all social contract theory follows the same logic, let's say. There's much more theories than the three we're seeing so far, but the three are the most important ones, right? You even have modern social contract theories, for example, John Rawls, if you're going to read a liberal social contract theorist. But of the three we're discussing, there's Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. They argue in a very similar way. It's like a literary genre. They start by describing how they think man naturally lives, right? So humans in the Garden of Eden, and then Eve eats the apple, and God kicks us out. And now what, right? How do we naturally live immediately after that? Because that will tell us something about how man naturally is, right? Because it's, let's say, before history happens. So they're going to give their opinion on how they think people naturally live together, how they naturally act, how we naturally are. To say something well about human nature, right? Are they good? Are they bad? Etc. What's important here is that these are philosophical statements. None of them are historians, right? None of them did archaeology or have any knowledge whatsoever of prehistory or even a concept of prehistory, right? So keep in mind, social contract theory is not science. Second, they're going to give an estimation of, given how people are, what would they want from politics? Or given how people naturally live together, what problems do they face? And thus, what do they need politics to solve? What do they need society to do? And this is, of course, where they're going to shape their ideology. And then they're going to answer that question in the third step. They're going to say, okay, well, in order to get that, given how people are, given what people want, this is the type of constitution they would want. This is the type of social contract they're going to sign with each other to live together, right? So they're going to reason what principle or what agreement lays below society, right? Portraying society as a contract and thus putting certain rules on the king, right? Or maybe there's not a king at all, depending on the contract. And that's, let's say, how they think about politics. I would still use the word social contract today in a similar sense to describe basically like the basic rules of living together, right? It's important to understand that social contract theory is philosophy and not science. Um, these are thought experiments, all of them, right? None of them come from genuinely studying people. They don't go out and study how people really are. They're people who sit back in their chair and think, how are people, right? So they're thought experiments, all of it. And we're going to start today with the first and probably the most shocking one of them, of Sir Thomas Hobbes. Do you hear me fine, by the way?
Yes, yes, doctor.
Okay, good, good. Um, so Thomas Hobbes. To start with a disclaimer, I totally don't like him. And it will be very obvious in my tone this lecture. Well, you'll have to deal with that. You'll soon understand why once we get into things. Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes, unfortunately, lived from 1588 till 1679, which means he got very old, right? He got around 90, which is yeah, around 90, which is very old for that time, right? He got to a very late age for living in the late Middle Ages. Um, and during that time, he mainly practiced philosophy. He was one of the three first. He was one of he was the first of the three social contract philosophers. And of the three of them, they all kind of represent a different archetype of politics. You have Rousseau, more socialist, you have Locke, more liberal, and Hobbes is the authoritarian of the three. Because what we're going to talk about today, what he's going to argue for explicitly, is tyranny. He's going to make an argument of why there should be absolute rule, quite similar to Machiavelli, except he is Machiavelli 2.0, let's say. He's a lot deeper and he goes a lot further than Machiavelli does in arguing for a tyranny. For maybe you could see him as the grandfather of fascism in some sense. Now that sounds very radical from today's perspective, right? Some would argue for theory, what the fuck. But we have to understand that in his context, he lived in that. He lived in absolute monarchy in England. He's British. So he's not arguing for something that isn't already there. He's justifying how things are, and he wants more of that, let's say. And to understand him, we really need to understand this context, because otherwise he's gonna look so evil, and he kind of is, but we have to like work with him. Um, he lived in a time that was very chaotic. He lived in a time where if you watch Game of Thrones and you take out the dragons and the zombies, that, right? The Rose Wars, the aftermath of a bit later, the aftermath of the English Revolution. He lived in a times where there was a lot of civil war in Britain, and they killed some kings, and the king had a hard time establishing his authority again. And he was very scared of all of this, which should sound familiar because it's the same story that Machiavelli has, right? They're both scared old men. And that's going to influence their teaching. Because like all authoritarians, you're going to see the same with Hitler, you're going to see with any of them, they always start from a position of fear. They're fundamentally scared of life and of people, and they're going to think of a theory that makes you scared as well, and you're going to look for a strong protector, let's say, out of fear. So that's this core emotion. Now, although I made clear so far, I don't really like him. I cannot skip him because he's that important. He's very influential on philosophy. A lot of books after him, including the two we're going to see, the two next authors, are really replies to him. Um, he both quite broad appeal. He has influence obviously on fascist thought and authoritarian thought, because that's what he's arguing for, but also in a weird way on liberal thought. We're going to see later at the end that not what he's arguing for, but the way he's arguing is attractive to certain, well, rich people, to certain liberals. And the other reason he is quite successful and a classic is that he's simply very good at writing. His books make sense. His books are very detailed, or very fluently written, for that time at least, for the Middle Ages. So, well, late Middle Ages, early modern times. So he is important. One last thing about him, we're going to talk about this more next time, but these thinkers all are on a different scale of the empirical rationalist spectrum, where empirical thinkers are more about facts and are more about figuring things out, and rationalist thinkers are more about logic and arguments. Hobbes is 100% on the logic part of the spectrum. Hobbes doesn't really care about opening his window and looking at the world. He's just a guy sitting at his desk thinking very deeply about things. And we see this also kind of his limit. Like he's very good at logic. That's why it sounds coherent. But he doesn't know too much about the world. All right? Oh, by the way, if you don't think he's a creep, check him out. Woo. Um, so this is him. Imagine you could take one portrait in your life, and this is how you dress up. He's quite the gothic dude. Um, so Thomas Hobbes. Let's start with idea of nature, shall we? Now, I'm going to preface this slide by telling you, dear students, that you really have to pay attention to what I'm going to say. Because what's written on the slide is very easy to misinterpret and take you down the wrong route, and get you all kind of confused. So please take my guidance, right, in explaining this. Because if you take it wrong, it just is gonna mess with you. So his idea is that we should not study politics, right? We should take some lessons from studying nature itself. He lived in a time where philosophers were trying to be like scientists. Science was in its infancy, yet the first actual science going on. And usually philosophers were very inspired by that and trying to do the same thing. So what were the sciences that were popular in his day, right? In his day, what was popular was something like early physics. Not very advanced at all yet, the field, but they had some notion of it. Mathematics was advanced. Mathematics was ahead of the other sciences. We knew a lot more about numbers than we knew about reality back then. Astronomy was ahead of its time, so we understood the sky a bit better. And mechanics, surprisingly. So mechanics was way ahead of its time. We were able to build small robots way before we understood digital, the concept of digital, or the concept of software, of algorithms. But they could already back then build a bird that if you wind up the bird, it waggles forwards and it moves its head. Because it's a bit like a watch, right? Like very complex watches that can move and that can, you know, simulate things. They could already do that 400 years ago. So, and that looked very like science fiction-y to people, right? They're like, oh, it's a real bird. Of course it's not, but you know, it's a little machine that moves. And people are very impressed by mechanics and this kind of mechanical way of thinking. And that's what he is very inspired by. So he's looking at mathematics and such, and he studied mathematics. Um, he said, well, look, there's certain just eternal laws here, right? In physics and chemistry, etc. I want to find eternal laws of human behavior too. I want to predict humans in the exact same way as we can predict the movement of the moon. So that's what we're going to try to do here. And that's his whole ambition. That's where kind of everything goes wrong. So what's this idea, right? Listen to what I'm saying, especially later on, because this can be confusing. He says, look, nature, right, it works a certain way because I can predict how it works. And it works a certain mechanical way, right? If I can model a bird into a little machine, to a mechanical machine, then maybe I can model everything, right? I can also make a little model thing like a clockwork about the movement of the stars and like the moon goes up, right? And then and the time and whatever, like a big clockwork. So if I can do that, then probably nature works in a very mechanical way. And we are part of nature, right? So maybe we must work in a certain way too. Maybe there's some kind of basics physics to us. Like one thing hits it, it reacts to that, right? This is basic movement of things. And since we're in that, um, maybe we function in a certain way as well. In other words, he thinks of the human mind as mechanical, not literally mechanical, not like if you crack open your skull that there's little metal pieces there, but it works like a machine, he thinks. He says we think based on our instincts, right? We just happen in a way. Like we get impulses and that's how it's his idea. Like a machine, more or less. And there's a fixed way, right? You cannot change your mind. Your mind works a certain way, and that's how you're going to act. And if that is true, this very scary idea, if that is true, then society is going to work a certain way too, because society is made out of people who are going to work a certain way. So if you put them all together, you're going to get one central dynamic, and thus all societies are going to be roughly the same, which by the way is absolutely not true, but we're working with him. And this politics are going to be a certain predictable way. So just like I can predict the moon, I can predict politics, right? And this way of thinking is what sometimes is called determinism. Is the idea that things are what they are and will what they will be because they had to be like that, because things just work that way. And there's no other way of doing things, right? It's the opposite of what today we call constructivism. Constructivism is the idea that things are what they are because we made them like that, right? Things don't just work that way because they are intended to work that way and there's no other way of doing things. No, we just pretend that's how it has to be, but really we could change it. Right? Today, 90% of social scientists, 95% are constructivists. The determinists did not win this debate. And let me explain you why, right? Because there's a lot of ways to misunderstand this. So his way of thinking, in a very broad sense, he's not alone. There's other more deterministic way of thinking, even till today. They're all losers, but even till today. But his way is particularly wrong. it already. So his mistake is that he knows actually quite little of science, or not that he knows little of science, but science back then was very primitive, right? For example, he assumes that physics is mechanical, which it is not. Physics is not orderly, is not determined. Um, Higher order physics is, but the fundamentals of physics are quantum physics, which are chaotic, which are free, which are undetermined. But they won't know that for another 3 centuries, right? And the other thing he gets wrong about nature is that he assumes that everything is physics, right? There's just movement. Well, that's not how how reality is built. Reality is built in layers, and each layer adds total new capabilities to reality that are both more and different than the previous layer. So you get new types of possibilities and effects with each layer of complexity. Things are not just a more complex version of the previous thing. They are different. So let me explain this. So you have physics at the bottom, right? The build-up you have quantum physics. Well, you have physics, okay? Things move, they hit each other, and then that creates a reaction. You could have physics um, without electromechanics, right? Things influencing each other without touching each other. You didn't need that, but that's how reality works. We have electromechanics in reality, okay? On top of that, you have chemistry, right? Chemistry obviously exists in the physical world, but chemistry is not physics. If you put two elements together and they explode, that's not because how hard you jam them together, right? You can do it very slowly and get the exact same effect. It's because of the chemical properties of the elements, which is just a new set of reality that is not physics, right? It's in physics, but out of it emerges a new set of capabilities. Okay, out of chemistry, next step is biology, right? There, biology is based on chemistry, yes, but biology is different because in biology things are alive. Yeah, nothing in the table of Mendeleev of chemical elements wants to be alive. There's no intent to survive in uranium, right? So biology comes with this whole new thing of intent and of just life itself, and of continuous processes, which wasn't there in chemistry. And of biology, right? Then you have all kinds of different animals. You have humans. You have sociology. You have psychology, right? We have consciousness, which is not reducible to just biology. It's just a new element of reality, right? And then if you're religious, you could say the spirituality or whatever, but we don't need to go that far, right? The point is that there are a lot more capabilities between simple physics and us that he didn't understand uh, were possible, right? But okay, let's work with him, right? Let's assume we're robots, as we say, right? We didn't have the idea of robots back then, but let's say we're robots. That's his idea, which I already told you I think is wrong, but whatever. The next question, if we go with him, is what type of robots are we, right? Well, we are evil killer robots. That's the answer. He says, man, who's fully ruled by his instincts and cannot change that, is inherently selfish and cynical. We are, at our core, we are simply bad. Well, he would never calls us bad. He says we're selfish at our core. And we don't really care about anything besides what our body tells us we want. So we're not even trying to hide it, right? You have the saying of people being a wolf in sheep clothing. Well, Hobbes says no, we're a wolf in wolf clothing. We're just directly bad, not bad, directly evil, right? Um, people will act on their instincts, and their instincts are antisocial, fundamentally antisocial. And that would be okay if we lived in heaven, where I can just eat and have sex all day. I've probably been in a good mood. But I don't live in that situation, right? I live in a painful, annoying world, and therefore that's gonna bring out the worst in me. The worst is already there. You don't have to dig very deep. But if we live in a world of scarcity, a world of struggle, that's going to bring out the worst in people. And our prime instinct that is causing this, right? The most important instinct, what humans are really trying to do. And here's a very simple view of human nature, right? We want to avoid pain and we want to gain pleasure, and that's it. There's no further complexity in this. Um, which no psychologist will subscribe to, but whatever, that's what he's thinking. But above all, what this leads us to want to is to survive. That's our strongest instinct, and that goes above everything. Or at least that's what he thinks. That's definitely what he wants. He's very concerned with survival. And thus, the most important value in life, and the only value in life, is security. So we saw this is very similar to Machiavelli, right? But security, he says, comes from power. It's the only way we can kind of feel safe, if we can kill the thing that makes us feel insecure. But our natural state is one of a war, because we're all trying to get power to feel safe, which kind of is the opposite effect of us all attacking each other, right? He said the natural state of humanity is a war of man against every man. It's one big death match. It's the Hunger Games, the part of the Hunger Games in the Hunger Games, right? It's everybody against everybody. And that sucks. He doesn't like this. He says, life, this famous quote of him, is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That's how people naturally are. That's what happened after the Garden of Eden. One big death match between humanity, and it's hopeless because we're all these killer robots, right? Because you're not safe alone. You might think, oh, I'm going to stay away from people. But that's worse because now, first of all, other things can attack you, like bears, for example. And second, what if you do meet people? They're going to kill you then, right? So you're not safe if you're alone, but you're also not safe together. If you live in the middle of a big city, now you're in the middle of the chaos. You're in the vortex, right? So now you're certainly going to be troubled. So we're screwed because we're all crazy killer robots. But what are we going to do about this? Now we get into his BDSM nature of Thomas Hobbes. So, oh, like, that's not the end of his book, right? It's not like, oh, everything sucks, the end. He says that there's a way out. There's a way out of this. Because besides that we're mechanical, we somehow also possess reason. He just states that. He's correct in stating that, but it's a surprising conclusion from what he says earlier. So he says we apparently are able to understand ourselves, and what we understand, if we're rational, is that we need to cooperate. Right? We understand that this short, poor, and nasty way of living is not our best life, and it would be better if we stopped killing each other. We can rationally understand this. So what we need is peace, right? We need to stop the anarchy. We need to stop the fighting. So peace is always better than war, he says. Always better. Any peace is better than any war. Any peace, including a total surrender, right? At any cost. Peace has to be achieved at any cost, he says, because there's nothing else that matters more than survival, including freedom, whatever. Any other value is subject here. But to have peace, I need to trust you, right? But for me to put away my battle axe, I need to trust that you're not going to stab me next or try to steal my stuff. And the question is, can we trust each other, right? But what he's going to do here is that, so he's going to create a society Not because society is good, because society is bad, but because society, the goal of society is for us not to attack each other, right? The goal of society is to coexist. But there's nothing good about it. Like society itself has no value, right? If you compare this to Aristotle, the point of society is to bring out the maximum potential of people. That's what Aristotle says. Hobbes is like, nah, there's no potential. People suck, but we have to live together in some orderly way to feel safe. How can we do that, right? How can we trust each other? In short, we can't, he says, because you can't change your behavior, right? A Stoic would say, well, if I have all this evil inside me, I'm going to focus my energy on not doing it, on resisting these impulses, right? Or Christ, your Bible as Christ would say, well, there's both good and bad in people, but we're going to focus on the good, right? Hobbes says, no, you can't. You can't do this. There's no good people. And if you say you're a good person, right, and if you actually are a good person, that, I don't know, is based in themselves, on love or whatever, religious values, Hobbes would just say you're insane. You say, no, it's not that you're not a robot, you're just a robot that's defective. Like something's wrong with your gears. You're not functioning right, right? So these so-called good people are just people if their chemistry they're off. He's very stubborn in his view on humanity and that it cannot change. So we cannot trust each other. So the only way to act right is not to somehow change your way of thinking. It is to be forced. The only way we're going to act differently is if we are forced to act differently. If we're whipped into order. That's going to work because that's impulses. We're going to react to those impulses. So we're going to act right because we're forced to. So we need a government that punishes us for acting bad. That's what's going to create trust. I'm going to trust you because if you don't act right, something bad is going to happen to you, right? So while what he's saying is logical, there is some weird jump he makes here with the rationality, right? So I'm able to understand my own motivation. I'm able to understand like what I'm doing wrong, but I cannot somehow change that. It's a kind of weird thing, right? Like I understand my instincts, but at least I think all of you feel like you could at least try to act on that, right? But he doesn't. Also given the circumstances, right? I'm portraying it as these evil people, but he never used the word evil. He just says these circumstances bring that out in us and we cannot control it, right? So how are we going to do this? Well, we're going to sign a social contract. Now we get to the point I was talking about. We're going to, all people are going to use their mind and we're going to understand we have to cooperate, we have to come together. And what we're going to do is that we're going to have an agreement amongst each other. An agreement that both generates the trust and does something. The agreement is we're all going to forsake our self-help and we're going to give that power to a boss, to a sovereign, and that sovereign is going to create order. So then what does it mean? It means if you steal my chicken, I'm not going to chase you with a knife. I'm going to call the police and then the police is going to chase you with a knife, right? I'm going to stop fighting other people. And I'm going to give that freedom away to a ruler who's going to fight them on my behalf and create order and to keep everybody in its place. So we can only trust each other because we now have this leader who we must trust. He's going to make sure that we're reliable. The leader is gonna force the law on us. So it's a contract of submission, right? We submit ourselves to this absolute leader, or better said, to the state, which Thomas Hobbes calls the Leviathan. Leviathan is a biblical concept of some big monster. So a Leviathan is like, I don't know, did any of you watch Pokemon or are you too young for that?
Yes, I think at least some of us watched
Watch it.
Pokemon.
Yeah.
Do you know what a Snorlax is?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Imagine the state like a giant Snorlax. Just some huge thing that falls on you, and now it's on you. And you're like, oh my god. That's how he wants the government to be. He wants, that's what the Leviathan is. Leviathan is the state which is so heavy that it controls you and it just smothers you. It's like in your face with its boot. So every time you're about to do something bad, you just get smacked. You're like, ow, oh, I'm sorry, police. That's what he wants. He wants a state to be really on top of people so they are going to act right. Not forever, necessarily, right? Until they act right. But it's like this hard control of the government to have all the power to make sure we're going to act right. Yeah, Leviathan is I think, biblical sea creature. Anyway, imagine it just as a gigantic monster that's oppressing you. That's what he actually wants. Matter of fact, Leviathan is the name of his book. That's where all this theory comes from. In case you want to read it, please don't. But it's called Leviathan. He says that sounds pretty bad, right? Having the government smother you. Of course, it sounds bad. He knows it sounds bad. But he says, but look, you have to understand what your alternative is. There's only two choices. Either we live in anarchy and you're gonna die quite young, or we have this. Everything else is fantasy, right? Because it's not based on human nature. Everything else is just short-lived and will immediately collapse after one generation because we cannot really be different. There's only two options. It's either violent anarchy, and anarchy is bad, or it's my absolutism. And a rational person that wants to live is going to choose my absolutism. Now, one consequence of this is that his concept of society is very shallow, right? The country, the nation, is really more like a corporation, It just works together to a goal, but there is no sense of community in what he thinks, right? People, there's no we in Thomas Hobbes. Because there's only me and the ruler, right? I signed a contract, not with other people, because I cannot trust other people. I signed a contract with the ruler, right? I give away my freedom, that ruler is going to keep me safe. That's the contract. There's no me and you are going to do nothing, right? You just happen to be here. They get sedamente, you're also here. Too bad, but there's no us. So, and there's also no political relationship because you only signed this once, right? You signed the contract. That means you're now part of the kingdom. And that's it. The king's not going to come back and ask what you want, right? That's just a singular moment, which, by the way, never actually happens, right? No dictatorship ever started with people signing a contract to live in a dictatorship. It's not how it works, right? This is a fantasy. So that's this kind of concept of society and politics. Now, how does that translate into practical politics? Well, it's all going to be based on authority. So, in his idea, society is nothing else but a contract, an imaginary contract that we didn't even sign, but there's just this basic understanding amongst people, and that's only visible. The only way we kind of what relates us is the state, right? But the state's not a democratic state, or the state is the government. The state is just the will of the sovereign. So it would just be AMLO and the police. That's it. That's all that binds Mexico, right? There's nothing else really there. But this has some interesting consequences for philosophy. Because he says, well, his ideas on the law are interesting. He says, look, Just like Machiavelli, he's going to reject the idea of morality. He says, look, humans are these killer robots, right? So since we act on our instincts and we couldn't do it differently, there's no point in talking about how we should act. Because there's no objective basis. We act how we act, and that's it, right? There's no point in talking about how things could be different, because they couldn't be different. And this, you can't really judge people in that sense, right? There's no external morality or ethics possible. She says the only way to have morality, or the only way to have an objective standard of morality, is to make it the same thing as the law. He says morals is nothing but the law. If you act according to the law, you're good. If you break the law, you're bad. He says that's the only objective moral standard here. And the law is the will of the sovereign, right? The law is whatever the leader, the Leviathan, is going to dictate. And if you follow that, you're a good person. If you don't, you're a bad person. That's it. There's no like really judging your soul or something like that. Now the consequence of this, and this is where liberalism enters, and what rich people like and corporations like, is that if this is true, that means that everything that is not illegal is good, right? If you don't write in the law that you cannot do something, you can do it, and you cannot be judged. So for example, it's nowhere in the law that you cannot cheat on your girlfriend. Therefore, you can cheat on your girlfriend. Yeah, you can't cheat on your wife, maybe, but you can cheat on your girlfriend or your boyfriend. Because hey, it's no law, so why are you judging me, right? You can see why rich people like this logic, right? Why corporations like this logic, why lawyers love this logic, where, oh, but it's legal, right? I'm doing horrible things to society. Like I'm, for example, dodging taxes and just firing people due to tricks. But hey, I can argue some way there's some legal exception and can't judge me. That's where this comes from, right? So either like Leviathan is going to oppress you, but the Leviathan doesn't say you cannot do it. Nothing's going to stop you, right? If lying is not illegal, you can lie all the time. That's this negative concept of law. If it's not in the law, it's legal. It's fine. And it's not just legal, it's morally just. But the law is going to be there to keep us safe, right? Now, since nothing else than security matters, right? And since there is no morality outside the law, we have no real basis to resist authority. Because we cannot judge the leader because it couldn't be any different. And because, we have no moral standard to judge them by. As long as they apply the law, they're doing what they're supposed to do, and that's it. The only way you could resist the leader is if the leader loses control, right? If the leader cannot uphold his end of the social contract, if they get weak, basically, and provide security to society, then they can be replaced. But in the other society, in the other case, you have to shut up and keep it moving, right? If you don't like what they're doing, totally irrelevant. It doesn't matter what you like or not. That's not what is here. What you like is to do nasty things to other people. That's what you really like, Thomas Hobbes would say. So shut up and keep it moving. Now, who is going to be this leader? Is the next question. So Thomas Hobbes says, I don't really care. Like, if it works, it works, right? As long as somebody is the undisputed boss, I will accept them. I'm definitely not going to risk my life resisting this person. Because, my whole theory is about me never leaving my house and not risking my life. So if you're going to be the boss, you're going to kill the old boss, and you're going to have the story, it's fine by me, right? You want to elect that, you want to, I don't really care. But if I have to answer the question, I'm going to say I prefer the king. Why? Because the king is already there. Right? We don't have to have this fight of who's going to be the leader, because we already have one. So that's one thing to fight about less. So let's have the king. The king is orderly, The king's son is going to be the next king. There's no disputes here. This is, this makes sense. Let's have a king. And just like Machiavelli, he tried to advise the king, right? Machiavelli is directly writing to the king. Hobbes is not. He's writing to the general public. But he did send his books to the king, and what he was trying to do in real life is try to gain favors of the king. The funny thing is that the king hated him. Because he's this guy who's always trying to he's like this annoying person that's always trying to get in your good side, but you really don't like them, but they keep trying. He was like that. He's like, King, I wrote a book about you, about how you should have all the power. Yay. The king is like, all right. And why? Is it because God chose me? Is it because I'm the best? Because I'm the fairest? And Hobbes like, no, it's because life sucks and there's no other option than having you as the king. King is like, what the fuck? Get this dude out of my sight, right? It's not very flattering to the king. Yeah, I should have all the power, but because there's no alternative. So he argued for absolute monarchy, except that monarchs didn't really like him. Another reason they didn't like him is because he was kind of an atheist. He was not officially an atheist because he was way too scared of the church. But it's very clear from his writing that he doesn't believe in things. He's kind of the opposite of Christ, right? He's the Antichrist, Thomas Hobbes. So his view on religion is as cynical as Machiavelli's, a bit more cynical. So he says there is no religion. They're like, okay, there is a God. I'm going to say there's a God because I don't want police to get to my house and give trouble for me. So there's a God. I'm praying, I'm going to church. But really, this is all some bullshit. So what we really need to do is to subordinate the church to the state, right? And religion is how you know he doesn't really believe. He says religion has to be whatever the king wants it to be. I'll believe anything, right? If the king tomorrow decides it's radical Islam, because radical Islam is better at suppressing people, like in Saudi Arabia, for example, as we saw last class, then radical Islam it is, right? Whatever, man, I'll just do it. As long as religion works to keep people in line, as long as people believe this story, and somehow that's going to trigger some guilt instinct in them and they're going to act a bit better, great, right? So if you're a religious person, this should really offend you. Because not just is he atheist, it's all a joke in a sense. There's no value to religion. There's no point to it except that it helps to suppress people. He really is the Antichrist, Hobbes. So let us make a recap of this. In summary, 1, people suck, and we're doomed to be selfish cowards, right? I use the word bad all the time, but selfish is the better word here. And we cannot change that. 2, what we want is power and self-interest. And that's the only thing we can strive for. And everything else is a fantasy, right? If you think you're a pious, good person, no, you're delusional. That's why. Jesus is just, I know, he smoked crack or something, right? He's just a weird dude, Thomas Hobbes would say. Normal people are following their self-interest. And that means that naturally, we live in anarchy. And anarchy is bad, right? You have some anarchists who are like, yay, we live in anarchy. But they think anarchy is good. They think anarchy means freedom and it's a good way of living. Hobbes doesn't agree that. Hobbes hates anarchy. So anarchy is evil, it leads to suffering. So 4, the only way out of this is if we all agree to the authority of a sovereign that's going to impose the law on us and it's going to make us safe. So 5, this sovereign is going to get absolute power. Their will is going to be the law. That includes if every man has to grow a mustache, then every man has to grow a mustache, damn it. as long as people are acting lawfully, right? And of course, the king should try to make it good, right? If he can create a good economy, that's all the better. And if he can, if his laws feel pleasant to us, even better. But most important is that we follow this law, right? And that's okay. That's okay as long as he protects our life and our property. I didn't mention property yet, but this is, of course, the bottom line, right? Almost all right-wing theories are, at the end of the day, about protecting property. And so is Thomas Hobbes. So, at the end of the day, what he really wants, and what this is really about, is to keep poor people away, right? To have a strong police. So if people are gonna riot, people are gonna get tired of things, that they get smashed by the Leviathan. Because Hobbes is already on the good side of Leviathan. He's with the king, remember. So that's Thomas Hobbes in summary. I have more to say, but let me pause here and see if you have any questions. Or any doubts, anything I can help you with in your confusion. No?
So,
Okay. Let's see. 57 people. We're at low. As Trump would say, my ratings are not good. Naomi, you do have a question.
Kind of, but I don't know how to ask. When Hobbes said that he wants to know how humans work, did he mean like physically, right? Like, or how they think? I was a little bit confused. I don't know if
He
you
didn't
could
study
explain.
people. He didn't, he's not a psychologist. Like, he didn't study people. He just, it's all based on logic. It's all based on a thought experiment of him thinking how people are. I know that answers your question.
Yeah, it was a really simple question, but I was a little bit confused.
No, this is all just a hypothesis. You don't need to believe any of thing he says, right? It's just a way of looking at things.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Miss Fernanda.
yeah, good morning, teachers. So I have a question. Like, Hobbes also was like the base for realism. Well, a part of it because he said, well, you said he thinks that people suck and that men were selfish and evil. So that's one of the bases of realism.
Well, he never used the word suck, right? This is my summary of it.
Well, yeah.
He says people have selfish instincts, and in a tough situation, and all situations are tough, they're gonna come out. If we lived in heaven, we would behave because we'd have no reason to get angry. We don't. So the bad circumstances are going to bring this out, but we're kind of doomed to be in these circumstances. Wait, what was your question? I got off.
Yeah, it was like if he made the some of the basis for realism.
Yes, but Machiavelli more than him. Machiavelli's earlier, right, saying similar things. But yes, he goes on that same logic, right? And this logic of um, the base premise that you should start reasoning from individual self-interest. If you want to predict people, you have to predict their self-interest. That is a base of realism and a base of much of political theory after him. So he did influence that, yes.
Okay, thank you.
So let's talk a bit about his influence on things. Influence is both an authoritarianism, which is obvious because that's what he's directly arguing for, but also on what I'm going to call bourgeois liberalism. So on the more philosophy of the rich type of thinking. Why? Because at first sight it doesn't make sense, right? Why? How could he influence the liberalism if he doesn't even believe in freedom to start with? Well, because not of what he wants, but of how he's arguing it. There's certain ideas he brings to the table while making his argument that are interesting to liberals. First one of them is his focus on the individual. Um, he starts from the individual person. There's no group, there's no community, there's no religious, there's not what God wants. All of this doesn't matter, right? It's about you. And liberals like that it's about you. Second, the idea of self-interest as the main motivation, which, for example, in a lot of economic theory is also the base assumption, right? People act out of self-interest. Which is quite contested, right? You have a lot of things in life that are simply inexplainable, like suicide or suicide terrorism. You cannot explain that in a simple, you act to survive logic, right? And there's a lot of phenomena in the world that you can't explain by this, but they'll say on average, a lot of economic theory, on average is going to assume that people are going to do that, that they're rational, self-interested actors, which is also very convenient if you are a selfish person, right? If you are a selfish person, there's this dude who tells you that humans just are like that, then that's going to vindicate you, right? It's going to make excuse for your behavior because apparently you couldn't do different. You're like, oh, well, this is just how I am. So people who aren't like that are going to like these type of theories. And what liberals like is this reduction of morality to legality. The idea that if it's good, it's legal. If it's bad, it's not legal. And there's no judging or hating on people outside of that, right? It's this very legalistic focus of ethics. Is authoritarian theory, which is more clear, right? If you want to have an example of this, so Machiavelli, my example was the Hunger Games. Of Hobbes, I don't know if you watched Mad Max, Fury Road. It has this. Yes, no, you were gonna answer that, did you?
Yeah, I was gonna say yes.
Yes.
It has this man called Immortan Joe in it. You can see in the middle of that picture, and he's kind of the dictator of this oasis, and he's a terrible ruler altogether, and things are very inefficient. But the idea that you get from it is that like it's either him and you're gonna live in society, or it's you alone in the desert. So having this strong guy is better than having nothing, right? That's the logic of it. I'll be right back. Give me 1 minute. All right. Any questions so far? I'm about to get in my criticism of him, but I want to give you the opportunity to comment something of yourself if you want to. Is this clear what I'm explaining?
Yes.
All right. Shaia, Regina, no questions? I need some kind of elevator music for this waiting for questions moment. All right, if nobody has any questions, then let me discuss a bit about him. So, although it's quite clear I don't like him, right? And to kind of be transparent with you, I also make him look bad because I'm kind of narrating him from today's perspective, right? And that makes him sound a lot more radical than he really is, because he was already living in this kind of situation. So what he's proposing is not that weird in his day. Yeah. And I kind of changed the language. I portrayed it a little bit harder than he says it, so you'd understand it more clearly. So I did stack the cards a bit against him, right? And he is a very smart and talented guy, but there are still some things that I want to criticize in his thinking. So first of all, I think he's simply wrong on his base assumptions. He's wrong about basically anything of factual claims because he doesn't really care to know. He just doesn't care about empirical reality. No psychologist is gonna, maybe they agree with like some of his logic, but not exactly what he says, right? Is gonna agree with him. Nobody who actually studies people. Maybe some people think that people are fundamentally selfish, but not in this super simplistic, you have two instincts and that's what guides you way, right? It's because he simply doesn't, like, he couldn't know any better, that's true, back then, because science wasn't that advanced. But he is overconfident in what type of things he pretends to know and what far-reaching claims he's going to make about you and your mind on very little knowledge of having just no concept of psychology to start with. So we'll criticize him for that. I also think that his social contract is a bit rushed in this. Not that the book is rushed, but like it's a very big jump from the state of nature to us then suddenly rationally agreeing to live together, even if that never actually happened. So he doesn't really explain how society happened, right? Because you must understand, he says this is the only way things can happen. Humans are programmed like this. So if that's true, then everything that happened in history must have happened for that reason. So when exactly then did we sign the contract that elected this king? There's no historical record of something like that ever happening, right? So it's a bit clouding real history there. Also, what's just not likable about him is that he doesn't leave any room for other experiences, right? I think most of you know at least one person you consider good. I think most of you, not all maybe some of you are drug addicts, but most of you think you have at least some self-control, somewhat, some time at least, right? So you have to really think the way he thinks for this to make sense. But politically speaking, like let's say he's just right about what he's saying. Let's say I have no scientific problems with him. Pure politically speaking, my main problem with this type of thinking is it's totally unambitious. He only gives you one thing. Like his social contract is just a bad deal. I give away everything, and all I get in exchange for that is peace. Well, if you wanted this, there are other ideologies that just do more. Like if you want a strong state, you could as well be a communist. But in communism, you also get equality, you get community, you get free services, you get all this stuff, right? So he doesn't really talk about, he talks a bit about economy, but not in a way that follows from a general theory, right? You you get so much more in other ideologies for the same thing. So it's just a bit unambitious. You can't sell me one thing as a politician. You can't be like, oh, my only thing I'm going to do for you is keep you safe. Okay, how about healthcare? How about education for my children? How about aid? How about climate change? Like this, okay, there was no climate change back then, but it's way too unambitious. One of the things I personally look at or look for in politics is ambition. I want somebody with like a big plan about how we're going to do things, not do just one thing. So if you like this way of thinking, both fascism and communism do the same but better. So, but that's his trick, right? His big trick, his big illusion is that he pretends like there's no other option. That's the determinism. He says you work only one way, right? We can't change this. So it's either anarchy or it's totalitarianism. And if that's your choice, he might be correct. He might be correct that totalitarianism is better. The point is just that's not your choice. They have more choices than this. And also what he argued for, and to understand just what like you have to understand how oppressive his conservatism is to people. So what he's arguing for in practice is just monarchy. There's nothing original about it. But the way he argues for it is so oppressive because he says this is not just how it's supposed to be. This is the only way it can be. Like it's natural. This is how you work. Don't even bother resisting the king, right? So this is like this takes away all agency from people, which makes it like the end of the conservative spectrum, right? Things have to be like they are now. There's no other. Okay, so I criticize him a lot to keep Mr. Abel to keep at least one illusion of objectivity, right? I'm going to defend him now. So I don't like Thomas Hobbes as a philosopher, and I think you should forget about him. But he's not always wrong. I could defend him. There's certain situations in what the big thing, not his state of human mind, but his big point that authoritarianism is better than chaos, in which it makes a lot of sense. There are practical situations in the history of the world, right, where you have an authoritarian government that does avoid chaos. And you don't see that until you remove the government. And then chaos starts. And it's worse than it was. So think of Iraq, for example. It's Saddam Hussein. Oh, Saddam Hussein, evil guy. Oh, let's kill him. Okay, we killed him. Civil war. Millions of people died, right? And the country is still unstable. Look at Syria. Oh, Assad, bad guy. Let's get rid of him. Democracy. Yay, protests in the streets. All right. 8 years of civil war. Country totally destroyed, and Assad is still alive. So you could as well not have fought him, right? I'm defending the devil now here. Or the best example is Libya. In Libya, you had a dictator called Gaddafi. Gaddafi was not the worst dictator. He was a bit sadistical, but country worked. Country wasn't that poor. But at some point, he said something that people interpreted as genocide, and they got rid of him. They killed Gaddafi, and Libya just totally fell apart. They're still in civil war. Nobody has real authority. It's very unclear who exactly the government is. Tourism totally collapsed. The economy collapsed, and there's no rule of law. Slavery is back. People are selling slaves again. So if you're a kid growing up in Libya and some dudes came and kidnapped your mom and sold her as a slave, and you find this book, Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes, it's going to make a lot of sense to you, right? You will want security over everything else. So I think that Hobbes, there's lessons to learn from him. And it's easy to think that if you remove a dictator, things are going to be different. We also have this, although he's not a dictator, but he's like the closest thing we have. People have this illusion that you could fix Venezuela by just killing Maduro. Like if he was dead, then tomorrow, the crisis would just stop. And there would be no crime. Right? That's not, you don't know that. Maybe things totally collapse, right? So I think that's how I would, if I would have to defend them, I would point at those situations. Since you do have a choice, I think it's less appealing. And lastly, Mr. Abel, I know you're getting tired of me. You're like, oh my God, when is this guy gonna shut up after this slide? Last thing I want to reflect on, some kind of bigger reflection. I want to take together a bunch of things we saw in this course, and talk about politics in a general sense. So let's move beyond Hobbes here. We're going to talk about the politics of fear and fear in political thought and how powerful it is. Most right arguments have something in common. They follow a similar logic. They're based on a fear of competition, fear of the other, fear of uncertainty, fear of the unknown, and the idea that humans are a certain way, a fixed idea of human nature, right? Black people, indigenous people, poor people, they just are. I know, they're lazy. It's inherent in them, right? These people are like that. That's very common in right-wing thinking. And that allows two things. It allows them to scare people from alternatives. If you remember last elections, kind of the mode in which PRI and to a lesser extent PAN kept power is not to defending themselves. They're like, we're corrupt. We all know this. But that's not the point. The point is that the alternative to us is worse, right? AMLO is a danger to Mexico. If you're going to vote for him, he's going to release all prisoners. It's literal TV ads about that he's going to release all prisoners. And things are going to be chaos and civil war, and the world's going to end. So if you looked at last elections, nobody tried to defend Peña Nieto. The PRI was not like, we did a great job. They didn't say that once. They just said, that's going to be worse, right? If you vote for him, it's going to be chaos. Don't vote for the PAN either, because they're not going to win. We're going to win. We're going to defeat him. That's kind of the case that they made. Didn't show you any idea. And what it also does is if you have this fixed idea and you think humans cannot change, then solidarity with them. There's no point in helping other people because they're not going to change. So that's all right. Now there's two types of philosophies that take this logic very far, right? You can see this in general right-wing arguing that is based on fear. Conservatism and fear go well together. But there's two types of philosophies that take this to the end that are more deterministic, that like Hobbes is. So one of them, there's two like strands of thought that go very deep here. One of them is fascism. We saw this already. You saw that Hobbes and Machiavelli are kind of saying the same thing. We're later going to see that Hitler is going to be also thought. Although with Hitler, it's not based on mechanics, it's genetical. Like Hitler thinks that, black people naturally are inferior, therefore it's okay to kill them, for example. That's clear. But the other strand that you might not fully comprehend is going this direction is what I call egoist anarchy. So anarchism is a very broad club of political ideas. And you have very jolly, optimistic, humans are good anarchists. Those are the people you want to hang out with. They're typically also, the Rasta wielding, pot smoking, resist authority type of anarchists. They're the cool people. But you also have a more selfish strain of anarchism that's simply against the law and the things we should do, that we should be able to do whatever we want, literally whatever we want. Just to give one example of this type of thinking is Marquis de Sade. I think you might have heard of him, who the word sadism is based on, right? You horny teens might have read some of his work, and oh yeah, he says, he gave me my sexual liberation. Now I dare to kiss a girl. Yeah. Did you also know that de Sade was convicted multiple times. He went in prison multiple times for drugging and anally raping his own staff. He's been to jail, I think, 3 times for that crime, that he sodomized and paralyzed his own butlers. And of course, once he's in jail, he's like, oh, this is so unfair. I'm going to write a book about how you should be able to do whatever you want sexually. So you're thinking, oh, he's telling me I can kiss another girl. No, he wants to justify rape. And a lot of people like that. You have other people, Stirner, for example, young people for some reason like him. What he really wants is to legalize rape and slavery. That's kind of his end goal in his theories of anarchism, why there should be no law. So this is not, at least not to me, very interesting. So what's my point? Girls, talking to you in specific, right? If you open a book, on the first page it starts like, we are nothing but our instincts, or, you know, our mind is programmed to do this or that. You should close the book and throw it out of the window, because you already know how this is going to end, right? And the last thing you need, ladies, the last thing you need is men making more arguments about how they cannot control themselves. That's the last thing we need, right? So this is why I suggest you follow more the path of Master Yoda, and understand that fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, and hate leads to suffering. That's my case against this. So, fear in politics, a dangerous thing. Any questions, dear students, or things you want to say? Maybe say, teacher, you totally misunderstand Hobbes. This is how it is. Please help us. What's the best idea to deal with selfishness of people? Well, you have the liberal answer to that, which I don't believe, but the liberal answer to that is that you would design a system that kind of uses that selfishness for good, like capitalism. Or the other idea is that humans act partly depending on their environment. This is more the communist alternative. And if you create an environment of equality and opportunity, then people are not going to be selfish. And you can simply change them. If you raise people differently, you could change them. And your third alternative, the one of Rousseau, is that you simply reject this idea. You're like, no, people are not selfish. People's base instincts are social. But that's for next week. We're going to see that alternative to this. The one I like the most. All right, students. Did you understand this lecture? Did you like it?
Yes, Doctor.
Yes, I like the references.
All right. Good. Then next time we're gonna see something way more positive. Next time we're gonna talk about what John Locke. John Locke was more of an optimist, and a bit closer to our current world, his theory. So that's what we can look forward to next. All right. So don't have nightmares about Hobbes. Just make it to next class, and we're gonna fix that. All right.
Yes, teacher, thank you very much.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you, Doctor.
Bye.
Have a nice day.
Thank you, doctor.
You guys too. All right. Bye.